Okay, let's rock and roll. Hey, thank you so much for having me here today. It is I am a farmer's seedsman. I sometimes refer to it as a recovering seed grower. Yeah, you know, my family's life, long history in the seed industry. So it's pretty cool to be able to present some thoughts from the standpoint of myself, as well as the Real Agriculture audience, which is farmers across the country of Canada. So, I enjoyed last Monday's event. It was very, very good. It kind of gave me some things to sort of key off of. I think right off the top, I would very much sort of agree that, describing this as a once in a lifetime or generation opportunity is it sounds really good, but boy, does it put a lot of pressure on a lot of the stakeholders in this room to try to figure out what is the right way forward, which presents I think a lot of conflict and combativeness, some friction, which is you need some friction to come to a consensus at some point. So friction isn't necessarily bad. Real Agriculture started in 2008. We've come a long ways from a guy with a video camera and a tripod. Everybody looking at him like he was a fool, to be quite honest with you. Covering farming and ranching issues for across Canada, as well as into the United States now with our partnership with Rural Radio 147 on Sirius XM, as well as broadcasting through RFD TV. Giving Canadian perspectives on that channel every day, as well as making regular weekly appearances on AgriTalk, really the flagship farm radio program in the U.S. So from a very humble upstart to really becoming much more of a North American play, it's pretty cool to be here with you today for this issue of great seriousness and consequence. So let's get to it. Okay. So I had said this to somebody last week, and it kind of think describes this whole situation very, very well. Whether we've talked about the Canada Grain Act review or value creation or seed industry amalgamation, or where we are here today with SRM, we are kind of engaged in this sort of seed industry soap opera. And what I mean by that is another person said to me last week, I walked away for 4 years and I came back to the conversation and nothing had changed. And that's sort of like Days of Our Lives. The characters are very constant and they're familiar. I can almost predict with people on different sides of opinions on the aisle on what we're going to talk about here today with SRM, that their questions and statements are probably rather predictable. Views are very, very entrenched. So as I heard last week, really encourage everybody to sort of, no matter what side you're on here, is to really kind of step back, take the individual out of it, and really think about the broader, what's good for the broader sense for the industry. We're here today to understand the farmer. And I think a lot of times when we try to understand the farmer, we make the same mistake we make in public trust discussions, where we think about the consumer as if it's this sort of mystical, utopian one person that we are trying to target and market to and please. And we know quite well, even inside the boundaries of Canada, that consumer is very, very diverse. And the same goes for the farmer. We see this in our audience at Real Agriculture all the time. I don't care if it's seed regulatory modernization, or it's what's happening with the protests and the blockages at the border, or name anything that is in the news. I will be able to find you members of our audience that are on opposing views of any topic, which makes this discussion here today just ever more challenging, because we are trying to do what's right for our customers, the farmer, and it's a pretty diverse group we're trying to target here. There's not just one single answer, which really makes this extremely much more complicated. Oh, slides are not advancing. There we go. The maze of decisions here, though, is really complex for the farmer right now. Capital requirements to operate a farm in any part of the country. I don't care if you're out in the Okanagan Valley, or you're in southwestern Ontario, or somewhere in Western Canada. The cost of land continues to go up. The cost of machinery continues to go up. There's a lot of pressure from that standpoint, huge barriers for entry. And meanwhile, while they're trying to operate their business in this ever-pressing, changing environment, there's issues with succession as farms try to keep their family and their business sort of together and families talking over the long term. Market's been extremely volatile. We just have to look back to the fall of 2020 and where we have gone from there to now. And what we've seen with some of the commodity markets as well as input prices now, a lot of pressure on the farmer in making his decisions. Some of the broader issues, things like shortage of labor and that never goes away variable that is out of our control, which is weather. And so the farmer really has a lot of decisions to make when over the long term and in any sort of a growing season they're about to embark on. What we're talking about today is change. And there's people pushing for massive change, basically blowing our regulatory model up and starting from scratch. There's people looking for more incremental change. There's also people looking for no change. I think, one of the phrases out there is, people hate change. Well, it's not hating the change. A lot of times it's just they don't understand the why. And I encourage you to focus in this whole discussion a lot more on the why instead of change just for change's sake when you're thinking about this in the farmer context. The reality is, though, we're really not in control of a lot of the changes that are happening around us. We're in control of what this regulatory framework will look like going forward, but there's a lot of changes that are happening around us that are completely out of our control. And if we don't like change, we're going to actually like irrelevance even less. I think that's very, very accurate in this case. You look at the farmer on the left. At that time, I don't know what year that would be from, early 1900s or a long time ago, maybe 100 years ago. That farmer probably thought as he's riding that tractor that this is as good as it's going to get. I could just not see the changes or the technology. I just couldn't see it getting any better than this. And we know that, that unit there, although very reliable at that time period and did a great job and was a huge step forward from horse and plow or a mule and plow, maybe in some cases, we know we've come a long ways. On the right, it's interesting because I hear some of the same sort of discussions that probably happened when the tractor on the left went from the steel wheel to the rubber tire and some of the way that change was fought. The same thing's happening now with things like autonomy and robotics. And the reality is I have to tell a lot of our audience many, many times is that whether you like it or not, there has to be somebody asking for this because these kind of products just don't get created on a hope, a whim, and a prayer. You really can't control the change that is happening around you. What you can control is how you adapt to that change. Here's what I'll encourage everybody on all sides of the aisle on this matter to keep in mind. Let's stop arguing about the day of the week. There's a lot of things that people that are here today do not agree on when it comes to where SRM should go. The key is to keep the solution to be customer focused. What are the things that we need to do so we can serve the farmer customer and ultimately, I think, also the processor customer in the best way that we possibly can? The solutions and the changes, if any, are made to the regulatory framework for seed. They should not be about power. They should not be about who controls. And I find many times as I talk to different stakeholders, as I talked to many people over the course of the last week as I was prepping for this, there's a lot of, there are some stakeholders that are really looking at, how do we craft this so that it's advantageous to whatever our interests are. And I encourage people to not do that. I would also say, I would encourage you to also look abroad. We may not have all the answers in Canada. We have a very good system. You all know that. I think we can agree on that. There are some challenges. A lot of them were identified last week, but don't be scared of emulation. I find a lot of times in Canada, we have this idea that our system, our situation is the best, and we shouldn't tinker with it. We should be afraid to have incremental change because it may disrupt our position in the world. Not to get into real controversial topics, more controversial than this one. I think kind of an example of this is how Canadians felt about their healthcare system prior to the pandemic to how they necessarily feel now. If you were to talk to Canadians pre-pandemic, many would say that, we had really one of the best systems in the world. And all it took was a pandemic to identify maybe some areas where we have some real improvement to do, especially when it comes to things like ICU capacity compared to some other countries in the world, our southern neighbor being one of them. It doesn't mean that we need an American healthcare system, but maybe there's some things that we could steal and emulate that would serve our system and make it a little bit better. I think that's kind of what we're trying to do here today on this topic of SRM.
Oh, shoot. Did I send £5?
Oh, if you could mute yourself, no problem.
Oh.
Yeah. Please use that mute function, everyone. Thank you.
All good. Okay. Regulation should not be a barrier. And you're going to see some of the farmer comments here in a second that really talk about this. Regulation is there to provide the guardrails. Okay. The rules of the game. It should not be there to stifle innovation and raise barriers that are really not needed. I think a good example of this is what we've seen in the rideshare market. We have seen prior to Uber and Lyft, if you thought about public transportation, you really had buses, subways, and taxis. So let's focus on the taxi market. To have in a city like New York City, to have one of those taxi medallions, to have, have a license to have a taxi, which is a restricted market, that medallion is worth a lot. That license to operate in the city, and you had to be a licensed taxi driver to give anybody a ride with payment. And what we've seen really across major parts of the G7 countries is companies like Uber and Lyft saying there's some other options here. Now, the taxi industry used regulation to prevent innovation, to prevent competition. And over time, we have really seen that many cities have dropped some of those barriers to allow there to be competition in the marketplace. Well, who has won ultimately? Well, as Uber still tries to find a way to make money, and I'm not sure that Lyft has actually made money yet either. At the end of the day, the passenger is who won. And that's, I think, we really need to think about this discussion is how do we create a system that lowers the restrictive barriers, increases competition, and at the end of the day, our customers like the farmer really at the end of the day win. Okay. We also see this a lot of times right now. The big conversations happening in the cattle sector in the US through COVID is, we have a lack of packer capacity. We need more competition. And so right now they're focusing on ways to try to do that. Part of that is looking at what some of the regulations are to be able to create more competition in that market. So a lot of industries kind of go through this cycle. And if you, at the end of the day, if you use the rideshare example, I really think what has also happened there is it's made the taxi, the legacy taxi industry, it's actually made them way better. If you ride in a taxi today in some of these cities that have Lyft and Uber, you'll see the technological advancements that they've been forced to adopt. When you're functioning in a competitive environment, you raise your game. You don't get sort of lazy with pushing innovation and the need and the push to be better because you're not facing that competitive spirit every single day. And so once again, that has also made, that has lifted the taxi industry as well. So let's get to some comments from the RealAgriculture audience. So what we did is I got some data points here and some opinions from farmers in our audience, and also some people that we polled farmers in our audience we polled last week, plus a broader section of farmers from our Farm Vision 2020 study that RealAgriculture did in cooperation with Justin Funk from AgriStudies. And so we have a partnership called RealAgriculture Studies to try to bring agricultural market research to Canada instead of us just constantly extrapolating US data all the time, which we seem to very, very commonly do in Canada. So here's what we threw together. Really thinking about it from the standpoint of your title today is Understanding and Meeting the Needs of the Producer. What does the farmer value? And maybe take a step back. Does the farmer understand what we're even talking about when we talk about seed regulatory modernization? And I'm not sure about that. And I'm not sure anything I'm going to show you today is very conclusive on that front. But I even saw last week, I watched last Monday's session, and there's a lot of confusion in our own industry about what the scope is of this SRM discussion. It will be one of my final thoughts. We have to be better at communicating as a seed industry on what actually the context of this discussion is. It is not value capture. It is some of these other things. And ultimately, what provides the farmer with the opportunity to compete on the global stage? We heard a lot about that last week. You're going to see that in some of the comments from the farmers. Market access and trade are really critical components of this. We heard Mark Brock last week talk about how his competitors are not in Western Canada. His competitors are his neighbors and those farmers in the upper Midwest, on the eastern side of the Midwest. So, competition is real. We can't ignore it. And we need to make sure that our regulatory system is just as competitive as some of the players that are working inside it: seed companies, seed growers, and farmers. So we asked the audience, we had 150 farmers fill out this very, very quick 3-day intake. This is not a massive study. This is basically trying to get really kind of the pulse of where our audience sort of stood on this. What's your familiarity with the seed regulatory modernization consultation being conducted by CFIA? Very few people said extremely familiar. The biggest block there is somewhat familiar. And of course, number 2, not so familiar. And that's by their own definition. We didn't test them after the fact. Like, okay, so you say you're somewhat familiar, answer these 5 questions to really gauge it. I'm actually surprised. I'm assuming though, if you did that, more would fall into the not at all familiar, based on what we saw in some of the open-ended comments that we're going to get to. So that's the people that answered this survey. Take it for what it's worth. So we asked people, how often do you buy certified seed other than soybeans, canola, and corn? Obviously, those are 3 crops where there's a lot of certified seed purchased every year. Also, I think that when we say certified seed, I think a lot of people think about some of the other crops that are really a lot of this friction is being battled over here right now on this landscape. But 40% of the audience said, other than those 3 crops, I'm buying certified seed every year in some form or fashion. We didn't ask them how much, but that's just the frequency to see how much they're actually engaging in the system. So some pretty good numbers there from an audience perspective here on their familiarity, at least with the process of buying seed. So some open-ended comments. I've got these scattered throughout the slide. I did ask the audience, what are some of your thoughts in terms of areas to improve the seed industry? And I didn't put all of them in here, but I've got comments from all sides of the aisle. You'll see the word streamline come up a lot. A more streamlined registration process that focuses on delivering value to farmers and end users, higher yields, the people looking for traits, end fixing. Also price. Price comes up a lot here. And I think that's encouraging because that's, when I hear farmers talk about how I want there to be, I'm concerned about the pricing of seed, I think that really allows us to really think too about this is where increased competition comes into play. The more highly competitive a market is, the more we'll have more efficient pricing. Okay. I think that's common in a lot of industries when we think about economics. Plants with novel traits having a more expedited pathway. Once again, we're back to the streamlining, the velocity, the speed, people wanting the system not to hold up progress. Okay. We don't want it to be a barrier to innovation. So those are some comments that were made by the farmer audience that answered our survey last week. We'll get to some more here in a little bit. So when you buy seed, what is important to you? No, I don't think it's surprising to anybody. in the seed industry. I see a lot of ads from many of the seed companies that advertise on our site. When you talk to farmers, back in the day where I was actually selling seed as a seed grower, quality is important. Who's buying crappy seed? Not very many people. Two is price. So we'll get to price and its level of importance here in a second, but service and location, 3 and 4. This was a force ranking. So this was saying, okay, here's 4 things. I picked them. There is more, but here's 4 things. Rank them in their importance to you when you're making a seed purchase decision. I'm not surprised location is last. I think at one time location of the grower was critically important. When grower, I can remember as a kid, growers picking up seed in half-ton trucks or single axle dump trucks or tandems were like, oh my goodness, look at this. And now we sold our seed operation 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, and virtually everything was picked up in a Super P. So location becomes a little less important as the volume goes up in terms of the pickup. So those kind of all make sense to me. This is from our Farm Vision 2020 study, looking at what is important to growers when they're making input purchases. Okay. So today, when we attempt to identify the relative importance of purchase criteria for input decisions, we see that product performance carries the most weight. But when looked at in concert with some of the other factors, you see that collectively convenience and value added together equal the importance of product performance. When many products are considered indistinguishable from one another on performance characteristics, it's these other factors that differentiate. So notice price only amounts to 25% of the decision. It's important, but not as important as some of the other variables. One other point to consider is that there's no difference in value perception based on farm size. So I heard a little bit last week in terms of, larger growers, smaller growers, and, some niche plays, commodity plays. Be careful with that. And in fact, when broken down by specific farm income categories, we find the largest of farms value convenience or value added as much, if not more, than any other group of farmers. Okay. So just be careful with the making assumptions about size of farm relative to what's important to them when it comes to making input purchase decisions, including seed. Here's some more open-ended thoughts from the audience. I don't think we need any money grabbers like seed companies want farmers to fund their research on new varieties. Once again, this speaks to a misconception that the seed regulatory monetization has to do with the value capture, value creation discussion. Other people saying, hey, I'm pleased with the way it is operated now. Would like to continue to be able to keep growing our own seed. Other people focused on technology. A QR code in the seed tag could contain all sorts of info: purity, germination, percentage, origin, parentage, recommended seeding rate for various soil types, etc. More connection to what farmers and end users need, faster to get new varieties to market, and develop a precise, understandable information package for grower to be able to easily source. So a little bit more talk again about technology. We asked the audience, what is the biggest change the seed industry could make to benefit their farms? Technology being number one. Traceability was the fourth, but let's be careful there in the sense that doesn't mean that traceability is not important to the farmer. It's higher levels of traceability. So for these 150 people that we surveyed, it may show that the level of traceability we currently have is sufficient for them. The blue box there is more information on the seed tag and label. And the other one, the orange yellow there is improved variety performance. Clearly, use more technology is a bit of a push from the farmer audience that we polled here last week. The trouble with this is technology goes in a ton of different directions. So I'll let you to define what they mean by that in that bar graph. But I think it does call for the industry from the farmer's perspective to really consider ways that we can create efficiencies in the system by incorporating technology. Now, we know that one of the challenges with implementing technology and talking about technology is, making sure that it provides the ROI like we intend it to do. But I think this really provides the opportunity for those involved in the consult to try to figure out ways where technology could be fostered and become much more of a focus. If you go to any seed cleaning plant across the country, the technology that is used there is far different than it was on the seed farm that I grew up on and had to work in that plant. It goes for really kind of any sort of area. And you guys talked a lot about some of the technology things last week on in your program. The key is for things like primers and treatments and traits and those kinds of things is making sure that we're not setting up, once again, barriers to prevent innovation. I heard a little bit from some of the people on the panel last week, looking across the line and seeing somebody has access to a trait 3 years before we do in Canada, when essentially it's kind of the same growing conditions and we're having to recreate the wheel. I think that is a concern for a lot of growers that are trying to really work inside this very, very competitive environment. So what else did farmers say? This is particular to technology. Stable funding for new varieties and technology, higher yield cultivars with new novel traits. We need to lead in technology to succeed. So not just, same as, this grower pushing for, we need to be a leader in this area. Would like to easily access information on what targets the plant breeding industry is working towards and when producers might have access to these genetics on a field scale, similar to technological advancements in equipment. Work with the USA to provide technology both ways and allow seed and chemical to be sold on both sides of the border. Looking for a little bit more integration in the value chain, I would say, from that one. But clearly, as I went through, and what was interesting is I went through some of the responses, whether the person said they were not familiar all the way to very familiar, technology kind of wove its way all the way through all of those different categories. And it wasn't just one type of farmer that was saying this. So here's another piece in terms of, okay, this idea, just hold on. Sorry. We also know that the younger generation is more inclined to utilize technology to make decisions and are eager to make changes to farming practices. Today, 30% of farmers consider themselves early adopters early innovators or early adopters, and these are highly likely to be younger farmers. So not only do we have in our case here, where we polled our audience, we have a group of farmers that not only expect the seed industry to be focused more on technology. Our Farm Vision 2020 study really showed that, when you get to the younger set, that quest for technology is even higher, and they're looking to adopt. They're not looking to look across the fence and say, we'll see how this works out. A strong 30% of them are saying, I want to use some of this technology now. And so I think that it would be incumbent on the seed industry to, take that into consideration for sure. More thoughts from the audience, more RVT trials to provide better quality information on variety performance in localized area. The system is pretty darn good, especially where seed growers are directly involved. Person thought canola is a little bit less accountable. Develop new varieties and new technology faster. Canada is moving much slower than competitor countries due to regulations and an outdated Seed Act. One of the things about that too is, there probably are some people here that would provide some reality to how much slower we are, if we are, but the perception is there that we are slower, which is can sometimes be even more impactful than the reality. Support niche variety development. There's not a lot of development happening in some of these crops. I think flax last week was mentioned. I think we're down to like one flax breeder. in the entire country. Protection of end-use markets are critical. Lowering our standard to an American level would potentially ruin our end-use markets for world-renowned Canadian quality. Once again, a person concerned, let's be careful with the unintended consequences here. We have to consider that on the changes that we're making. Not all wheat in the U.S. is the same. You look at the P&W across the border. We're competing in a lot of those same markets as they are. You need to make sure that our regulatory system is just as quick and responsive and as efficient as theirs is, because there's an example of where Canada is competing, like for some of those high-end markets like Japan, with somebody that is just across the border in, say, the Moses Lake region or the Palouse. Okay, so let's talk about decision making. Just hold on. It's not good when a radio show host tries to lose his voice here. Okay, decision-making dynamics. When you look at how decisions are being delegated on the farm, we're finding that with inputs, there is an increasingly more involvement of others on the farm, which implies that on multi-gen farms, the next generation is starting to get involved with these types of decisions. So with inputs, it's more pronounced than with other categories of decision-making, like, say, finance. In fact, today, nearly 1/4 of farms report that someone other than the owner-operator is responsible for inputs, and other studies suggest that one of the first decisions that the younger generation is put in charge of is seed. So think back to those young people are not only making the decision on the seed purchase, they're also looking to adopt technology. And we saw in the survey there, that was the overwhelming one of the improvements that could be made to the industry based on the audience that we surveyed. Things to take into consideration. This data is from our Farm Vision 2020 study. So this is a little bit outside of the scope of today's discussion, but I think it's worth noting. The slide is very... it explains itself, but provides some context into the importance of convenience and value-added decision criteria. These are factors that are delivered by the dealer and often provided by a human being, okay? While not all farmers want a partnership with their retailers, those that have one truly do value it. They are less willing to switch, more willing to pay more, and really pay attention to the differences that exist between the retailers. At the heart of this is the relationship with the salesperson. People, no matter how much technology you implement, people still matter. So keep that in mind. One of the other mistakes is that people jump to technology and online buying. One of the things that Justin Funk and I have seen in some of our research is that despite the desire to implement more technology, it seems that only a small percentage at this point in time of farmers have much interest in purchasing products for their farm online. One of the things we have found is that when it comes to seed, the retailer relationship is very important, which could explain the lack of desire. This point is validated from AgriStudy's multi-gen farm study when it was discovered that the retailer relationship was much more important with respect to seed than it was with fertilizer or chemical. So that's one of the challenges here of the broad name of technology, is all the different rabbit holes that you can go down. Almost to the end here, more thoughts from the RealAgriculture audience. Too many also ran varieties are registered currently, or there's ones that have an Achilles heel type of flaw that you only discover after you grow it. I think from a certain portion of the farmer population, they believe that variety registration system we currently have is a filter for them. It is sort of that first run of preventing more Me Too's or varieties that they would be disappointed in from working their way through the system. Very, the opposite of sort of more of a open buyer beware sort of market in a true kind of marketing definition context. We need to stay world competitive without Americanizing our system. There is, the U.S. and America came up several times as words, and people on both sides of the issue feeling that we need to be more like the U.S. and other people like this person here. We need to be competitive without going the way of a US system that probably is a little bit more buyer beware in definition compared to ours. More economic friendly options for farmers. I think, economic friendly really, once again, leads to pricing. More choice of varieties and information tailored to my farm. This is where the data part really comes in, which obviously is a big part of the technology play. More emphasis on traits we need, such as soft fly resistant, 10 varieties claiming 3% yield increase. Not so much. Okay. So once again, this is open-ended answers that we got from our audience, people that participated. It was fabulous to have so many people in such a short period of time contribute to this discussion. So here's some final thoughts before we get to the Q&A. Focus on the framework. Less on the letter, when we get from A to Z, less on kind of in the middle. And more on how do we get to the things that are actually important for our customer. I use the example of in agriculture, a lot of times we get too wrapped up in trying to explain to people why we do certain things and how we do it. And it's really been a part of the whole public trust bent. I think when I go to fill up my gas tank, okay, and I pull up, and as a consumer, I have some expectations. And maybe I'm different than most. I don't know, but I don't think at all about how that fuel got into that pump. All I care about is there's actually fuel in the pump. My neighborhood gas station is competitively priced versus some of the others in the area. And the coffee is hot if I'm going to go inside. Okay. There's a real lack of understanding out in the farm community about, what seed regulatory modernization is in general. We're confused even sometimes, I think, inside the industry, like we talked about at the top. Focus on what the expectations are, and then how we are actually going to deliver on those things. How do we create an effective, efficient, competitive marketplace that brings in competitors? Because at the end of the day, if we have that, then we really have succeeded. We got to break through the barriers. Not put up barriers to prevent competition. Let's not, but I think it also should be said, let's not just change for change's sake. We got to think about the why here at the same time, and not only have answers to ourselves, but answers for people that are stakeholders in this process, the farmer customer. It'd be able to explain, here's why this is happening, and this is why this is a benefit to you. I think we've gone through a couple of examples here today. Regulation should not prevent disruption. Regulation should prevent chaos, but having some disruption in the marketplace, it really does create a flare for competitive spirit. Here, I'll use an example that I think sort of tells the story of real agriculture. The media industry is incredibly regulated in Canada, and then along came YouTube and Twitter, to a certain degree, Facebook, and it created an environment where somebody like me could start a media company and currently, compete with a lot of the big boys across North America. Okay. Disruption is good. It can be good. It can really, really foster innovation and value back to the end user. Okay. I think increasing competition is an incredibly important aspect of this whole process. Okay, I'm out of time. I actually went over by a couple minutes, so I do apologize. Looking forward to the Q&A. I want to wish everybody here the best in trying to sort all of this out. This is a tall order. This is a big task. A lot of pressure because of this once in a lifetime, once in a generation tag that's being put on this. It's easy to look back. It is incredibly difficult to look forward and try to predict. Think about that farmer on that tractor. He had no idea what was in store for him or his industry just 10, 20, 30, 50, and definitely 100 years out. So this is a big task, and I wish you all the best in your journey on it. Thank you very much.
Sean, thank you very much. Really great insights from you, things to think about from both you and your audience. Glad you brought those audience perspectives to bear today here as well. I would like to open it up to questions and discussion here. And I know there's a couple comments in the chat. I'll get to those in a moment, but it would be good to hear some of you out loud here. Any questions, comments that you've got for Sean? Use that raise hand function, please. And I'll be good to hear a few of you share out loud. So Sarah, go ahead, introduce yourself, Sarah, and the floor is yours.
Okay, my name's Sarah Wegg. I'm a seed grower in Alberta. I guess I wouldn't necessarily say my question is for Sean. Is that okay? Or
yeah.
Okay. It's more of a question for either maybe somebody in CFIA or a seed company person who works a lot in the regulatory aspect. There's some good discussion about plant breeding and plants with novel traits, but I don't think that we can actually change the speed of plant breeding through the regulatory system. So what I would like to know is how much time can we actually shave off the process of getting a variety to a farmer by changing the regulatory environment? Not all of these other things that are good and important, but not really pertinent to the regulatory modernization discussion. So are we talking like a year, 2 years, more? Like what's the amount of time we're gonna be able to save if we make some changes?
By changing the regulatory environment. Yeah. Sean, do you have a take on that one, by the way? Well,
Sarah, great to see you. I think a lot of times when people, I think a lot of times when people think about this is one of the ways to speed this up is the use of data from other jurisdictions. I'm not going to pretend to be a variety registration expert. I do hear frustrations from some people that, where are we at with the use of data? So, if a variety is successful in, say, Havre, Montana, are the growing conditions in Maple Creek are we able to use that? Are we having to start from scratch? I'm not going to pretend but that's the commentary I hear a lot as an example from people in the audience. So anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. And if anybody else wants to weigh in on it, please do. I'm going to keep going here down the line. M. Delaney, I think that's Michael Delaney. Is that you, Michael?
Yes, it is. Thank you. And I'm representing the Atlantic Grains Council on this call, and I appreciate the opportunity. I wanted to raise this issue from the point of view of participant dialogue. One of the things you mentioned, Sean, was this issue of collaboration. And several years ago, there was a working group formed to address the issue of value use agreements. And the sector unilaterally imposed value use agreements in Western Canada before the task team had completed its assessment of what the implications were. Now, for Atlantic Grains Council, we see ourselves as a seed importer. Our markets have a different focus than other parts of the country. And my view is that farmers have a role to play as their primary economist and agronomist. So if collaboration is important, then how do you see the moving forward if decisions are made before the exercise isn't completed? Thank you.
Thoughts there, Sean? Importance of collaboration.
Yeah. Well, I don't specifically know the timelines. I know that value creation definitely it's its own version of controversy when it comes to this. I heard a lot from our audience on both sides of the aisle, so to speak, on that one. Some very much in favor, some very much against. I think the key is a part of that collaboration discussion also is trust. I know one of the disruptions in that value capture creation discussion was, who agrees to it, who doesn't, people switching. I all I can say is, make sure that everybody understands kind of what the process is and the timeline, and you do what you can to build trust. It's hard to have collaboration if you don't have trust. And if you aren't willing to, I'm not saying this about you, Michael, so I'm speaking in general, so just make that clear. If you're not willing to open yourself up to trusting the other side, so to speak, no matter what side you're on, it's really hard to have collaboration. And maybe that might be the word that probably should be more in my address today is, how do we build some more trust amongst the stakeholders? Because right now we're kind of, we're John and Milena versus Stefano, to use the Days of Our Lives reference there they used at the beginning. There's just kind of this general lack of trust, and we just continue to embark on this soap opera kind of plot. So that's a change I encourage people to try to make here going forward on all sides.
Thanks for that, Sean. I'm just before I go to Simon, an interesting comment there from Glenn Wright in the chat, and I have a look at that, Sean. And it's, you used the Uber example, encouraging, competition encourages innovation, and the customer wins at the end. Now, you see Glenn's comment there? We got to be careful though. Like, what about some of the protections that the passenger in that example might be losing? Any comments on that one, Sean?
Yeah, well, yeah. So I thanks, Glenn. Appreciate it. Just want to get through it here. So it must be carefully considered what benefit the passenger gets versus the protections lost. Yes, Uber is popular, but there is a trade-off. Yeah, I think this gets back to the point of, in the case of the Uber example and Lyft, passenger safety is important. And so the regulatory framework, it's the guardrails. If you want to participate in this market, here's what the rules are. Last week, Christian Hebert talked about sports analogies, and I love to do them too. Not being a participant or changing the rules as you go. It's really allowing for people to compete. I think the concern is, in the case of the Uber example, that the taxi industry was trying to use regulation to prevent competition from coming. And the taxi industry did talk about a lot of, drivers aren't safe. These are, who knows who these people are, all this kind of stuff. And the reality is that, or is a taxi driver any more of a better driver than someone that's driving an Uber? I'm really not. I wouldn't be necessarily convinced of that. I never thought of that as I'm riding in an Uber. Is, oh gee, I hope this person's as safe as a taxi driver. That's something I think a taxi industry person, a lobbyist, would throw out as a reason not to allow these rideshare companies. But that's my opinion.
Thanks for that. Let me go to Simon Ellis. Simon, introduce yourself and ask your question or share your perspective, please.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Sean and Warren.
Hey, Simon.
My name is Simon Ellis. I'm a seed grower, and we have a seed retail at Wawanesa, Manitoba. You briefly mentioned about kind of the scope and people's understanding of where the scope is in these conversations. And it seems pretty regular that, we start getting hung up on the CGC regulations or past conversations about VUA. Do you have any thoughts on how we can better frame the scope so that people have a better understanding going into it, or how we convey that exact scope to people? If you kind of catch the question. So this is the case with Grain Act review stuff. This is, I think of, last winter's big controversy was the code of practice, responsible grain. And the same thing kind of really played out. Is I think too many times the organizing bodies or the stakeholders that are really working in the trenches assume the general farmer population is on top of it. Like they're just paying as close of attention as you are. And it's not the case. As a publisher, we have a lot of frustrations a lot of times where, there's a topic that we deem to be like, this is really going to impact growers. Like the 30% fertilizer reduction, possibly the government's going to entertain, is a good example of this, where we've been writing about it for a year. You can't get any prop underneath it, and all of a sudden one day it's like, for whatever reason, voila, everybody's talking about it. And so the other point to that, I'll use, some of these other examples I just gave, is don't mistake apathy for acceptance. And that is another thing that I find we tend to make. We need to do a better, when I say we, I mean, stakeholders, and maybe, include myself as media. Communication has been, we're the messages on why this is important or not important. It's not penetrating in all situations. And so maybe more attention needs to be paid to the comm side of trying to, just sending out a press release. This is what CFIA is working on. It's kind of that's a pretty low bar when it comes to comm. So clearly there's some challenges here. I don't know if that answers your question, Simon, just things I've observed.
Yep. Thanks, Simon, for the question. And thanks, Sean. Hey, Sean, I'm going to go to a question in the chat. It's one that kind of puts you on the spot a bit for your perspective. It's the last one. I'd like to put it to you. And it's from Linda Olson. Sean, from the data collected, do you feel that the current seed regulatory system is protecting the farmer and end user? Do you have an opinion on the need for change here, Sean?
Okay. Thanks, Linnell. Okay, so Sean, from the data collected, do you feel the current seed regulatory system is protecting the farmer and end user? Is it protecting them? Okay, so let's think about this from maybe a couple angles. So off the top, in a way, it is, because the bar for on certain crop types is very high for variety registration. Okay. Now, having said that, corn and soybeans that don't go through the same variety registration process, the system hasn't failed. So maybe that's a false protection. I also think that the current system does it provides assistance to seed growers. I think, as a person that had to choose what varieties we were going to multiply and kind of commit to from an inventory perspective, it can be stressful. It can be, there's nothing worse than getting, starting something at breeder seed and working your way to foundation and realizing it's a dog, right? That sucks. That's cost to an already very, very small margin business. I would argue that maybe the current system from a variety registration standpoint actually protects the seed grower more than it protects the farmer. That might really get people riled up, but that's how I would look at it if I was putting my recovering seed grower hat on. This is the same kind of stress that was created when the wheat board went away. That, what was it going to look like for those of us in the seed industry post single desk? This seems, although not as public, it probably feels that way for a lot of seed growers. It's just the unease about the future. And where they would sit. I would be thinking that and asking that, where do I sit on the go forward, depending on what this regulatory framework looks like over the long term.
Great. Thanks for that. Time for a couple more questions and responses. And there's good dialogue going on there in the chat. I know it's hard to follow it all, and I'm following some of it for you, Sean. Don't worry too much about that. Wendy, go ahead. Introduce yourself and ask your question or make your comment.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Wendy Yon. I'm the National Manager of Seed Section, and I'd like to thank you for the discussion this morning. I really enjoyed the presentation. I just want to comment on a few things. There were some comments on the scope, and of course, all of the issues around seed and grain are interrelated, and it's hard to limit it to talk about what's things that are, particular to seed regulatory modernization. So we really understand that. And we really appreciate, Sean, your comments and others' comments helping us to express the scope of seed regulatory modernization. And I want to be clear that some things that are not part of this current regulatory modernization process, such as value creation, you've said that quite accurately, the review of plants with novel traits and things such as gene editing, even some grain issues. It's not that these things aren't being looked at by the government in other contexts. It's about this process is more specific to things that are regulated by the Seed Act and regulations, with plants with novel traits being the exception, because there is a part of the seed regs that looks at environmental release. So I do appreciate everyone's help, and we'll, certainly take any ideas and input into how to communicate that better. And the risk of that is if we spend too much time, it's not that those things aren't important, but if you deal with them in the proper context, then you might get more traction out of those discussions. And if we deal with it too much in opportunities like this, we might not talk about the real changes that can come out of seed regulatory modernization. And just really quick, I just want to comment, Sarah made a comment about if variety registration really plays a role into shaving off time. And there's just one thing I'm not sure if everyone knows about variety registration. In the current variety registration system has a tiered registration system. It hasn't always been that way. And we set up the regulatory framework for varieties to be registered. But what's really neat about the seed regs and this flexible variety registration system is that it's the value chain that decides where the crop goes in terms of these tiered registrations. So when there are more requirements, such as testing for 3 years, it's the value chain, not the government, that decides where the crop should be. So we set up a framework, and it can go from maximum requirements for crops like wheat to minimum requirements for crops like oilseed soybeans. So it's just want to make sure people are aware of that it's not necessarily the regulations themselves that might impact that. It's more where the value chain sees the crop needing to be. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Wendy. Okay, I got time for a couple more quick questions and quick answers. Rob, you're up.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Rob Hannum. And there was a question asked earlier about the time. What's the time to change these things, or can time be sped up in variety registration? I think that's been well answered by Wendy at CFIA. Here's how I look at it. There's 3 levels of complex paperwork and stuff in seed. So the first thing is the Seeds Act. That's the governing act over top. And if you want to change the Seeds Act, that takes, I would say, 3 to 5 years. That's like a major thing to change. And that may not need to be changed very much. I'm not sure of all the details. Below the Seeds Act, there's seed regulations, and there's the weed seed order. And that's where variety registration stuff sits. And there is a tiered system. And I do agree, it's the industry. Industry includes farmers, grain companies, seed growers that choose where that crop goes. But if you want to change the regulations, that's like a 3 to 5 year process, I would say, maybe 18 months, but it's not quick. Most things would take 3 to 4 years. I know moving soybeans around in those variety tiers took years. The weed seed order, the same thing, takes a long time to change it. There's seed lab experts on the call who could say how long that takes. So below that, that's where we've got policies and standards. Probably the most common policy or standard people would recognize would be Circular 6, which is the seed growers' rules and for each different crop on how inspections are done and what's going to pass or fail. So Circular 6, and then if you've got a seed plant, you've got a quality assurance manual, and that's what you follow, and you get inspected to make sure you're following that. So here's my take: is that those things can be changed much more quickly, right? Because maybe we need to respond to an issue or a crisis or a new situation. And the governance of how those get changed, that's to me where it's really important. But I would like to see more things come out of regulations, become policies and standards, so there's more flexibility to update them and change them. people keep saying it's a once in a lifetime change. Why does it have to be that way? Why couldn't those things be more about policies and standards so we can change them more often in the industry more easily? It wasn't really a question, it's more of a statement, but I think Simon had asked that and Sarah had asked that, and I wanted to chime in with those comments.
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Rob. Hey, Warren, there's Kevin M was responding to Sarah earlier and said, I give a pulse example. As pulse breeders, we can release the same variety 2 to 3 years earlier in the US compared to Canada, was his example.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Thanks for pointing that out and sharing it out loud here, Sean. Okay. One of my jobs today is manage the time with this large group of people. Zenith, I have you in the queue. Here's the deal I'll make with you. You're going to be first up when we get to the panel. Okay. But I need to move things along just to keep us on schedule here today. So Zenith, I haven't forgot about you. I'll come back to you. Sean, good news. You have spurred some great discussion here so far today. Let me turn to formally thank you. Back to you, Chris, please.
Great. Thanks again, Warren. And just building on what you said, Sean, definitely want to thank you for the presentation and discussion today. I think you did a really good job of providing some context and as Warren said, stimulus of our thinking on this topic. And I think that's been reflected in the discussion that we've had so far and will hopefully carry forward to the panel. So I've got a really tough job trying to summarize all the things you said. I'm not going to try and do that. I'm going to just pick a few and a few things that stuck with me. And, you started off with some more general comments. And I think it's important to note, you talk about friction not being necessarily unhealthy. So presuming it's channeled in the right way and used to achieve that desired good outcome that we're all looking for, I think that's a really good point that we need to keep in mind as we go through this process. I think you also talked about the importance of broader perspectives and a recognition of the diversity in our audience, and with a focus today specifically on the producer. And the producer and the farmer is not homogenous, just like the rest of the population. So we need to recognize that diversity of perspectives. You spent a fair bit of time talking about change, and you had a quote up there. I think it was, if you don't like change, you're going to like irrelevance even less. And there's another quote in that space that I like that I learned from someone I worked with once, but it sort of buttresses that point. And it says, it's not the changes that do you in, it's the transitions. And, when we think about regulatory change and modernization, there's clearly a transition that goes when you make, potentially significant or even incremental changes. And so I think those are useful comments. Just a couple more, because I know we're tight on time. You talked about regulation cannot be a barrier, and about regulation being there to provide guardrails, not to prevent disruption, but done right can foster innovation and value. So I think that's really good. And a couple last closing ones. Your advice, I think, if I heard correctly, was to focus on the framework, and that from a producer perspective, farmers are less concerned, they're concerned about how the change impacts them, not so much how you get there. So focus on, how we deliver the change that's being talked about. And last but not least, I'll wrap up on this one. I think it's good advice. It's easier to look back and it's harder to look forward. But if we're all about designing a regulatory system for the future and that's agile and is going to be future proofing, I think we need to think about that. We need to look in that rear view mirror. That's super, super important. But we really need to think about where we're going in the future. So those were some of the things that I picked up from your remarks this morning. So on behalf of Seeds Canada, on behalf of the Seed Summit partners and all those in attendance, really want to thank you for being with us today. Cheers.
Hey, appreciate it very much. Thanks a lot, everybody. Good luck with this process. Thanks a lot for inviting me and having me here today. And thank you so much.
Thanks, Sean. Can we show our appreciation to Sean? There, I see one thumbs up there. Give us some virtual appreciation for Sean coming here and sharing his perspective today. There, you're getting some love, and it's Valentine's Day, Sean.